Order! O God, may your spirit and guidance be in us as we work for the benefit of all our people, for the peace and justice in our land, and the constant recognition of the dignity and aspirations of those whom we serve. Amen.
Morning, colleagues. We have a personal explanation from the Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Mr. Speaker, I want to provide a personal explanation to this House today about the matter of the termination of the Associate Deputy Minister of Post-Secondary Education Renewal. Media reporting yesterday gave the impression that I was not consulted by the Premier on the decision to terminate the employment of the former Associate DM. I want to state clearly that this was not the case. The fact is, over the last number of months, I've had a number of discussions with the Premier's office regarding the management of Aurora College and the Aurora College transformation team. 2 weeks ago, I approached the Premier and expressed my belief that a change needed to happen, and it needed to happen sooner than later. While I was not personally involved in the negotiations that took place following that discussion, nor was I aware of the final details of the arrangements, I was certainly aware of the ultimate outcome and support the Premier in her decision. I want to assure members that Cabinet believes firmly in being accountable to the public for its decisions, but there is a fine line between being accountable and ensuring that we respect the dignity and privacy of our public servants. We will make every effort to communicate openly what is happening in departments, but we have to be sure that we do not say anything uncomplimentary or unprofessional in public. As a result, we cannot and should not be discussing individual public servants in the Legislative Assembly or in the media, and I will not be commenting further on this matter in public. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Minister statements. Minister statements. Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, later today, I'll be tabling the mandate of the Government of the Northwest Territories 2019 to 2023. The mandate will guide the actions as a government and serve to hold Cabinet accountable as we work to advance the priorities of the 19th Legislative Assembly. The Northwest Territories faces unprecedented challenges. We've been elected in a time of global economic uncertainty, increasingly complex social issues, and multifaceted impacts of climate change. In the face of these challenges, I truly believe that the only way our Assembly can fulfill its promise to the residents of the Northwest Territories is to work together in the true spirit of consensus government. I speak on behalf of all Cabinet members when I say we are committed to a government that is open, collaborative, and cooperative. The mandate is built from the priorities we set together as newly elected members of the 19th Legislative Assembly in October 2019. It is strengthened by the input and advice we received from the Standing Committee on Accountability and Oversight. I wish to thank the Standing Committee for their willingness to work with us. Our shared commitment to cooperation and collaboration as members of the 19th Legislative Assembly gives me confidence in what we can achieve over the next 4 years. Mr. Speaker, I trust that all members of this Assembly will see their insights, ideas, and suggestions reflected in this mandate. I trust that residents will see a set of clear and measurable actions needed to make progress within the life of this Assembly and to hold this Cabinet to account as we work towards achieving our priorities. I look forward to working together in advancing the priorities of the 19th Legislative Assembly through the implementation of this mandate. Our mandate provides a path forward, yet it is not written in stone. We will encounter the unexpected, and we must be able to adjust course as needed. Mr. Speaker, I spoke of challenging times, and the need to work together to actualize our priorities. Working together cannot be done in the isolation of this House. We need to take the time to listen to those impacted by our services and to people working on the front lines of some of our most challenging issues. We all need to work together, Cabinet, regular members, Indigenous, community governments, and the federal government. We must remain mindful of each community's unique challenges and opportunities. We are committed to meaningful, positive change in the way this government does business. Very soon, this Assembly will debate the budget and what that means to advancing our priorities. We must bear our overall fiscal situation in mind as we make decisions in the weeks ahead, and we must exercise caution to only commit to actions we have the means to achieve. Mr. Speaker, there will always be more that we can do, but we know our needs outweigh our resources. This Cabinet welcomes the insight of regular members and looks forward to discussing how we can best apply our limited resources to achieve our priorities. But now more than ever, we need to be realistic in our expectations, creative in our approaches, and focusing on making the most of what we have. The 19th Legislative Assembly brings together leadership from across the Northwest Territories, from backgrounds as diverse as our landscape and people. We have been called a historic government in terms of our gender balance. We have begun to foster effective dialogue between Cabinet and regular members in the spirit of consensus government. We have expressed our desire and willingness to make the changes our people want to see, especially in the area of Indigenous relations, social outcomes, and economic outlook. The 2019 to 2023 mandate of the government to the Northwest Territories sets the direction for how we can seize opportunities to make this a pivotal term in the governance of the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Premier. Minister statements. Minister statements. Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yesterday the report of the Office of the Auditor General of Canada was tabled on the audit of early childhood and the kindergarten to grade 12 education system in the Northwest Territories. The report focused on 5 areas: inclusive schooling, Indigenous language and culture-based education, equitable access to quality education, programming, staff qualifications and training in licensed early childhood programs, and how these areas work to support student outcomes. The tabling of this report is timely, falling at the beginning of a new legislative assembly that has made it a priority to increase education outcomes to the same level as the rest of Canada. The recommendations from the Office of the Auditor General align with the areas where we have already begun to make changes or are planning to invest more resources and improve programming, and we have accepted their recommendations. While we are making some headway and seeing promising results with programs like Northern Distance Learning, small communities remain in greater need of support. One of our highest priorities over this life of this government is to ensure equitable education delivery in all communities across the territory. We will be increasing our efforts to address the achievement gap among small communities and larger centres and between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students to ensure that our education system is on par with the rest of Canada. Mr. Speaker, later today the Department is holding a technical briefing on the 5-year evaluation of the junior kindergarten to grade 12 Education Renewal and Innovation Framework. As with the Auditor General's report, this evaluation provides us important information on where select programs are working, where they need to improve, and whether they should be restructured to meet the needs of students. We expect to table our management response in the coming weeks to incorporate the recommendations of the Auditor General and the findings of the Education Renewal and Innovation Evaluation. A renewed Education Renewal Innovation Action Plan will follow later this year. Mr. Speaker, we all know that education is a cornerstone for a healthy and successful life. However, we can only be successful through the work of many partners, and education is only one of the building blocks. We will continue to work across departments and with Indigenous governments, parents, students, and with our education and community partners to ensure we close the gaps to improve student outcomes and provide youth with our best efforts for the future they deserve. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Minister statements. Minister responsible for youth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today I'm pleased to rise and speak to members about the celebration of the 2020 Hockey Day in Canada being hosted here in Yellowknife. The celebration was launched on February 5th and will continue to the 8th. This event marks the 9th year of the festive celebration celebrating hockey, one of Canada's national sports. Norman Wells, Delo will also play host to visits associated with Hockey Day in Canada, as well as Delaney, which is the birthplace of hockey in Canada. The festivities will bring children's hockey and officiating clinics, various hockey games, school visits, and N.W.T celebrities, and of course the Stanley Cup to Yellowknife. Celebrities participated will be part of the festival, including television host Ron MacLean, along with N.W.T NHL alumni Lanny McDonald, Brian Trottier, Paul Coffey, Wendell Clark, Darcy Tucker, and former women's national team member Cassie Campbell-Pascal. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the City of Yellowknife for planning this event. Thank you to the sponsors, including Scotiabank, for your support of each of the great community events. Thank you to all of our guests for coming to the North. We hope you are enjoying our world's renowned Northern hospitality. I'd also like to give special thanks to all the volunteers who help make this event happen in all the different venues. There have been a number of events that are part of the celebrations, including the Music of Hockey with performance by local artists, hosted at the Northern Arts and Cultural Centre this past Wednesday evening. The banquet held last night, which featured Ron MacLean and N.W.T alumni hot stove discussions in the Stanley Cup, an N.W.T Declaration of Principles breakfast hosted by the N.W.T alumni Andrew Ferris this morning, and later this evening, the celebrity and alumni hockey game. As mentioned earlier, there have been various hockey and officiating clinics and school visits scheduled throughout the festivity. Mr. Speaker, this is a wonderful community event which not only honors the great sport of hockey but also showcases the North. Northerners in the incredible spirit of the community that we all share is in this very special place. Thank you once again to all involved for making such a wonderful event happen. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Minister statements. Minister statements. Member statements. Member for Thabacha.
Mr. Speaker, today I would like to use my member statement to take the time to give thanks and appreciation to my constituents of Thabacha. Mr. Speaker, last weekend on February the 1st, 2020, I had an open house for my constituents in Fort Smith, and it was a very well-attended event. My constituents really enjoyed having the opportunity to meet with their MLA and hear the updates I had to share with them for what I've been working on since getting elected. Mr. Speaker, I am grateful to be the member representing Fort Smith. Showcasing your community at this level is a tremendous opportunity for all the members of this 19th Assembly. I also would like to thank the staff that serve the members of this Assembly for their hard work and ability to keep us informed always. I want to wish everybody a great weekend, and I look forward to continued dialogue on matters that concern the community of Fort Smith and the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Thabacha. Member statements. Member for Nunavut.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, Mr. Speaker, it's high school graduation rates in our territory. I wouldn't want to be in the Education Minister's shoes this week, Mr. Speaker. because of yesterday's tabled Auditor General's most recent report on performance audit on early childhood grade 12 education across our territory. Regular members had the opportunity to meet with Auditor General staff to hear about the findings, things that shocked me, Mr. Speaker. EC&E is using an outdated method to calculate graduation rates. The audit found that EC&E reported graduation rates that are 72% in 2017. Using a more accurate method, the auditor calculated actual rate was 44%, Mr. Speaker. We are graduating less than half of our kids in EC&E and is telling us they're closer to 3/4. Now that's the cause for a red alert across our territory, and not only that, in my riding of N.W.T, Mr. Speaker. To make matters worse, the audit found students smaller communities had lower graduation rates, less kids than Yellowknife. The overall graduation rate is 44%. That's what does say about our graduation system for our kids in N.W.T in our smaller communities and other ridings. The audit was pretty critical on the practice of social passing, which is something I've been against for a long time. In the past, I've brought this up 7 times in member statements, and it has to stop. That percentage of students repeating grades from dropping out increased dramatically from students from grade 10. The year in which social passing is no longer an option, when we keep moving our kids through the system. Even though we're not keeping up to academically to their peers. We're treating them with no better than cattle through a slaughterhouse, Mr. Speaker, and we're setting them up for failure. We have to stop social passing. The policy of this government has to stop. We have to take responsibility for making sure that our kids learning and understanding the curriculum before they're moving on to the next grade, period. Mr. Speaker, Standing Committee of Government Operations is holding a public hearing and audit, and this report will be making recommendations to this government and how EC&E should be implementing changes across the audit on their deficiencies. I'm putting this minister on notice and the members to expect to see detailed implementation with a plan, timelines that are provided to regular members to have input into fixing this mess that our education system is in. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for N.W.T. Member statements. Member for Nuvik-Twin Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today I'd like to highlight a couple areas from the Auditor General Report on Education in the Northwest Territories. Under the section of planning supporting the delivery of education, where it says the department did not take sufficient action in key elements of the education delivery, the slow process on Indigenous language culture-based education. In my community, the schools have language classes and they have language teachers, and these teachers are amazing, but we're losing our language. We're losing in N.W.T, we're losing Gwich'in in our communities, in our region. We have few elders left and a few adults that can speak fluent. Who will continue to teach us when they are gone? The students are not using their language beyond the classes, and this is not enforced on them. But I will have to say, Mr. Speaker, our school in Inuvik has done much improvements in providing culture-based education, and I want to commend them on that. They do moose hunting, they do trapping, they do geese hunting, they do a lot of ice fishing, and they go from kindergarten to whatever high school grade that wants to go with them. Mr. Speaker, we have to do something before the remainder of our language speakers are gone. I'm going to move into this section where improved support for inclusive schooling. Like my colleague, leaders, families, education boards, DEAs have been saying for years this is not working for our students. The idea seems great, but without adequate funding, adequate trained staff, and money for continuous training, this has failed our children, and we see it in the grade 10 where there's 40% have to repeat and another 15% drop out. Mr. Speaker, this is unacceptable. I'll move into the section on monitoring the delivery of education, where they did not adequately monitor the education system with collection data analysis, and this goes to my colleague, where The graduation rates. Now that it's public, we know that our graduation rates are worse than previously stated, and especially in our Indigenous students, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in order for us to succeed in all aspects of life, we must be able to ensure that our children are receiving the best education. If we can receive equitable education and graduate more of our own N.W.T residents, will be less reliant on the outside workforce to provide jobs in our territory. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'll have questions for the Minister of Education.
Thank you, Member for Inuvik-Twin Lakes. Member statements. Member for Mumfway.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker,
Mr. Speaker, when we talk about addiction, there's a lot of different issues surrounding that. A lot of community members are on a healing path, and sometimes they go through difficult issues with dealing with their wellness. Mr. Speaker, we know that there's a 28-day program, and that doesn't mark the end of the journey for such people. It's just the beginning. And they're also having issues with an aftercare program. Once they return, they don't have that support system in the community. We have a lot of elders that can help the community. Maybe we need to take a look at this
Mr.
issue.
Speaker, I ask the Minister of Health and Social Service and also the Minister of Justice to seriously consider partnerships with our Indigenous governments to provide programs for addiction, recovery, and treatment follow-up. Consider the Clean Chon, for instance. We have a beautiful facility beside Frank Channel, a place that is currently empty. It was once a lodge for guiding, a spacious main building, and a number of tent frames for additional accommodation in all peaceful, natural setting. Mr. Speaker, this is an excellent site for a pilot project leading to our permanent regional and territorial on-the-land treatment program, where we can utilize the elders as counselors. And Mr. Speaker, with the right local staff and the right on-the-land programming, the Frank Channel facility could provide hope, stability, and support recovering clientele that need to successfully continue their journey. And with that, Mr. Speaker, here we have elements of good foundation. A foundation that we can draw on Aboriginal governments, aim at meaningful addictions, recovery, and aftercare programming for our people. Mr. Speaker, at the appropriate time, I will have questions for Minister of Health and Social Service. Merci.
Mussey, member for Mumfway. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in my statement yesterday, I spoke about the ongoing problems with the new Stanton Territorial Hospital building. I got a first-hand look at some of the issues while I was a patient in the emergency ward for a day in mid-December. Frozen doors, alarms ringing, and a multitude of locked doors. At the same time, a constituent of mine was a patient upstairs for almost 2 weeks. He said that it seemed to him that a new problem would emerge every day. Problems included frozen doors, plugged toilets, alarms ringing, and freezing cold patient rooms. He was covered in blankets and saw staff walking around wearing long underwear and draped in blankets themselves. It seems no one could get or stay warm in this brand new $350 million building. My constituent came to the conclusion that the boiler was too small for the size of the hospital and the demands of northern cold. I don't think the heat regulation issue has been resolved because I continue to hear of patients complaining they are cold. The problems at the new hospital aren't only about the building. A letter from a group calling themselves N.W.T nurses said they were working non-stop in the lead up to the move in May and afterwards, putting their own health as well as the health of their patients at risk. An official in the Department of Health said in early June that the hospital had a 13% vacancy rate equal to 37 nurses. In July, the Union of Northern Workers launched a campaign called Worried But Working to draw the public and management's attention to the nursing shortage and the workarounds required by the problems of the building itself. The union requested a steering committee be struck to find solutions. Mr. Speaker, it's now been 8 months since the new hospital opened. The former head of the hospital said it typically takes 6 months for a building like this hospital to stabilize its systems. But 6 months is up, and many of the problems reported at the beginning continue. And what about the nursing shortage? Have new hires alleviated the problem of nurse burnout? It's time for the Minister of Health and Social Services to update the public on efforts to address the startup issues at the new hospital. Merci.
Thank you, member for Yellowknife Centre. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Ditcho.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to touch on the topic that the government of the Northwest Territories has been initiating climate change strategies to combat the effects of the greenhouse gas emissions. Nowhere in any of the documents says that we will accept, only 10% moving forward. And I assume with this climate change strategy, we're going to go in 100%. So, my concern, because I know in our communities for the past 10 years we've been putting wood pellet boilers into our schools and our health centers on the new builds. So we've been going that route for quite some time. The only company in my community that doesn't adhere to any climate change strategies to combat greenhouse gas emissions is probably the power provider in my community, which is Northland Utilities. And they're not the only ones. There's NTPC that's in other communities that are burning only diesel generation plants. And when you drive by them, you just see a puff of smoke coming out of their plants. They're not in any way trying to help the residents of the Northwest Territories to lower their cost of power, especially for electrical power. We don't see that. We don't have a voice anywhere. There's no watchdog in our government to really tell these guys, hey, we want you to look at alternative initiatives, I should say. Getting back to my statement, there was a document in 2014 that discussed or stated that they were planning on running the transmission line to Fort Providence. Since that time, as I was looking around, I didn't see any further discussion or statements or reports in this regard. So I assumed it just went by the wayside. It was put aside. Especially that initiative, at that time, there was no notices or letters or anything given to the hamlet of Fort Providence that there was an initiative, and currently there isn't any. Mr. Speaker, I seek unanimous consent to conclude my statement.
Thank you, member. The members seek unanimous consent to conclude his statements. Are there any nays? There are no nays. You may conclude your statement.
Merci, Mr. Speaker, and merci, colleagues. So we have a concern here. We got a strategy out there. Nobody's really adhering to it, especially the power companies. And I says, like, the watchdog group is not there. We thought the Public Utilities Board would have been, but apparently they've got other duties to regulate them that they don't ask the power companies to come up with any type of a strategy. So I think I'm going to have questions for the Minister of Infrastructure at the appropriate time. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Ditcho. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Here South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what is important to me at this moment in time is the homeless situation for men in Hay River. We have a number of people living on the streets in this cold weather. With all the resources we have at our disposal, we allow it to happen. Why? Because these very people who we know, who we grew up with, and who are our friends, do not routinely contact us as they are just trying to stay warm and staying alive. In this situation, we have to be proactive and take the first step in making contact and identifying immediate solutions before somebody freezes to death. Mr. Speaker, can you imagine yourself walking around outside all day trying to keep warm with no place to stop and rest? I know I cannot. You can only understand it if you live it. Maybe we, with some of the bureaucracy, should go live on the street for a few days or a week so we can get some small understanding of what some people have to go through day to day, month after month, year after year. This government needs a reality check when it comes to the homeless and experienced living on the street. May just do that. Mr. Speaker, when we talk about addressing the homeless situation, that is usually what we do, just talk. There are all types of temporary solutions that would work. However, when this government gets involved, it morphs into an unattainable major project that goes nowhere due to lack of funding, liability issues, government red tape, and not in my backyard argument. Government has to be involved in a supporting role to identify and commit the resources required to support workable solutions identified and put forth by the community and those people that are homeless as well. Mr. Speaker, in Hay River, we currently have a group of concerned people and institutions working together to provide a temporary and immediate solution for a men's warming shelter to cover off this winter. This is not an easy task when you need an acceptable location, building, power, water, fuel, permits, and the volunteers to make it happen. Mr. Speaker, I will be looking to the Minister of Housing and the Minister responsible for homelessness to provide some immediate financial support to assist the Soaring Eagle Friendship Centre, who is willing to take this project on and turn it into something more permanent. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Hay River South. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. In dealing with the huge legislative landslide at the end of the 18th Assembly, one of the most contentious issues was consultation with regard to regulations, especially regulations required to implement post-devolution legislation. There does not appear to be any standards or process for developing regulations that might include public consultation or even co-drafting with Indigenous governments. Virtually all the Indigenous governments involved in the co-drafting of the post-devolution resource management legislation requested in writing that they be involved in the development of regulations. This was largely based on the manner in which those bills have been drafted, where very significant matters such as resource royalties, requirements for benefit agreements, and more had been left to the sole discretion of ministers or cabinet. There are no provisions and no requirements for public engagement or co-drafting with Indigenous governments for any of these regulations to implement these new laws. Regular MLAs worked very hard. We proposed a number of possible solutions to the reasonable request of Indigenous governments, NGOs, business, and the general public for involvement in the development of these regulations. Public notice with an opportunity for comment, opportunities for ministers to enter into agreements on co-drafting, a legislative requirement for consultation, and other options were all attempted but failed to get any support from the previous cabinet. I'll have questions later today for the Minister of Justice on how our government is going to put into practice its open government policy and reconciliation with Indigenous governments in regulation making going forward. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Cam Lake.
Mr. Speaker, I believe the success of healthy, inclusive, creative communities starts with housing as a human right. Article 23 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights assures everyone that the right to housing and a dignified standard of living. Article 23 of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples invokes self-determination in health, economic, and social sufficiency and housing. Canada's first ever 2018 National Housing Strategy puts $40 billion behind a human rights and a distinctions-based approach to housing. Housing is a key pillar to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. The emerging international Green New Plans recognize that housing is critical to the knowledge economy and a climate-sensitive industrial system. Why is housing so critical, Mr. Speaker? Housing is more than a roof over our heads. Safe, affordable, accessible housing has proven to support better outcomes for our people, our communities, and our social cohesion. It is the foundation for strengthening our educational outcomes, our economy, our health, and social justice. How can children be ready to learn if they have not slept? How can adults meaningfully contribute to our economy if they do not know where or how they will keep their families safe at night? How can elders age in place without appropriate, accessible housing? How can communities promote inclusion, belonging, and participation without affordable housing options that connect family to our shared responsibility to care for each other? Housing is dwelling in this land, and it's caring for this planet. Mr. Speaker, our lack of appropriate housing is making our vulnerable populations, women and children, our Indigenous people, seniors, and people with disabilities, mental health, and addictions issues even more vulnerable. Mr. Speaker, when we think of our social priorities, we think of health and social services, justice, education, and ITI delivering programs independently. But what becomes of all of those investments when a parent cannot cover rent, when a child isn't ready to learn because they have not yet slept, and when vulnerable are homeless? Housing as a human right is square one, Mr. Speaker. Without it, we risk the loss of dignity, inclusion, employment, safety, personal fulfillment, and freedom, as well as our ability to be innovative, resilient, and caring. Because, Mr. Speaker, we are then less than human. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Camlake. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Gary Valancourt came north from Sudbury, Ontario in 1977 to fly helicopters. Though where he hailed from, I think he would deem irrelevant, as the North was his home and captivated him for over 40 years. Gary was hardworking, an enigmatic individual, and one of the first houseboaters on Yellowknife Bay. It is with a heavy heart and as a member of his community that I mourn his passing. I think Gary would scoff at the idea of me giving him an address in the Legislative Assembly. Unfortunately, our last interaction was him yelling at me about where to park my canoe. But Gary deserves this address. Without him, we may not have the colorful bay life that charms visitors and characterizes the Yellowknife landscape. Gary was a baron of the bay, housing many and helping more. He was a community-minded innovator who worked tirelessly and dreamed big. In the early 80s, Gary and friends such as John Alexander, Chris Holloway, Scott Mitchell built the first permanent houseboats. The barges were built out of 50-foot trees, telephone poles, and discarded aviation barrels. This was not the last houseboat he would build, rather the start of a floating empire. Gary was fiercely independent, and it drove him to learn many trades, and he was always willing to share his immense knowledge. Gary was a pilot, musician, builder, philosopher, and embodied the creative spirit of the North. The extent of his contribution to the culture and vibrancy of this city really cannot be measured. Gary is survived by his daughter, Molly, who is with us today in the gallery, many large community of friends, many ambitious floating homes. Thank you, Gary. You won't be forgotten.
Thank you, Member for Hayriver North, or Yellowknife North, sorry. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Tunadee-Wellesley.
Much show, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today I'm going to talk about medical travel in N.W.T. I feel like a broken record, but I feel like I need to drive this point home. Since taking office, I've already dealt with several medical travel-related issues with constituents. And with each passing case, I am seeing the same issue come up again and again. I'm seeing cases where people are dealing with some fairly serious medical issues that are in need of further assistance. So they're sent to Yellowknife or Edmonton for treatment. And doctors will recommend medical escort. However, our medical travel personnel are denied medical escorts in the vast majority of cases I've seen so far. Mr. Speaker, in most of these cases, it is elderly people who require medical travel services, and in the cases I've seen, English is almost always the patient's second language. So right there we have two strong reasons for why patients in these cases should be approved for medical escorts. We have to consider the state of mind and the body of that some of these patients may be in when being sent in for medical travel purposes. It can be a daunting and stressful experience when being sent alone to a strange place while undergoing serious medical issues. As well, I'm hearing first-hand accounts of people being denied a medical escort, even when a doctor recommends that an escort be provided for the patient. Mr. Speaker, I understand that our government is trying to cut costs where they can, and I believe that they're doing at the detriment of the needs of our constituents when it comes to medical travel and medical escorts. I hope to see more compassion on this policy front over the course of this Assembly. This area is in need of review, and I know that this issue affects all regions in the N.W.T and not only mine. And in closing, patients in care deserve the best care possible. And patients need to be informed of what's going on with their bodies. And these policy gaps put lives at risk. There are language barriers there that need to be addressed immediately, and I'm hoping that the Minister of Health and Social Services can speak to that a bit. And thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I will have questions for the Minister of Health and Social Services shortly.
Thank you, Member for Tunade-Welleday. Member statements. Member statements. Returns to oral questions. Returns for oral questions. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure to introduce my neighbour and constituent, Paul Falvo, who is joining us here today, and his daughter, Juniper, who is one of 3 pages from Yellowknife Centre in the Assembly this time. I'd also like to thank the other 2 pages for their work with us this week. Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife Centre. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Member for Great Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to take this moment to recognize 3 visitors in the gallery. We have Baldeep Bajwa, who is the branch manager for the Yellowknife branch of the Scotiabank. We also have Lucy Girton, who is a coach with Scotiabank, and the Vice President of Northern Alberta and N.W.T region, Tanya Perry, who are all here for Scotiabank, no, I'm not going to say this right, Scotiabank Hockey Day in Canada. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Member for Great Slave. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to recognize one of our pages here today, a constituent of Range Lake Riding, Ms. Brianna Willis. I think this is a couple of times she's been here now. Welcome to the House. Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to welcome my one of my constituents here today. Her name is Belinda Formanek. She's a grade 9 student at Sir John, and she likes dogs, music, and reading, but I think she likes us more because this is her 2nd time paging for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Cam Lake. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Member for Yellowknife North.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to recognize Molly McKinnon and her mother. Thank you for visiting us here today.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife North. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to recognize a couple of pages, Monica Kunderlich and Riley Hans. They've paged with us before, and I know they're very attentive to all their duties and want to thank them for all the help in the House this past week. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Frame Lake, recognition of visitors in the gallery. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. If we have missed anyone in the gallery today, welcome to the chamber, and I hope you are enjoying our proceedings. It's always nice to have an audience with us in the house. Merci. Acknowledgements. Acknowledgements. Colleagues, today is the birthday of one of our members. Please join me in wishing Minister Polly Chin a happy birthday. Also, I was told she was wishing for all the questions today. Just kidding. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Mumphy.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker,
when I talked earlier, I mentioned about alcohol and addiction and how to do the treatment for people, and to
have is what programs are currently in place here in the Northwest Territories to provide addiction treatment and addiction recovery care. How many programs are there in total? Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Mumphy. Honourable Premier.
Oh, Premier.
Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I'd like to talk about the mental wellness and the addiction recovery action plan that supports the priorities of this 19th Assembly by increasing the number of variety of culturally respectful, community-based mental health and addictions program, including aftercare. I'd also like to address the member's question on what are the type of programming that we have for mental health and addictions. We have a number of programs, Mr. Speaker, including the Community Counseling Program. We also have the Northwest Territories Helpline. We have facility-based addictions treatments. We have On-the-Land Healing Fund. We also have a program, Family Violence Shelters. We have a What Will It Take family violence campaign. We also deliver and prevention promotion workshops, including mental health, first aid, and applied suicide intervention skills training. Also talking about mental illness. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Mumphy.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I was strictly referring to addiction treatment and addiction recovery care. However, I'll move on to the second question is on the land treatment program. How many of our on-the-land treatment programs do we currently have in our Northwest Territories, and where are they located? Masi.
Thank you. Member for Mumphy, Minister of Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Department of Health and Social Services delivers On-the-Land Healing Fund in partnership with Indigenous groups. This budget is approximately $1.8 million a year. It supports community development facilities focused on mental health and addictions. The member asks which locations, and if I can get back to the member on the location of the On-the-Land healing programs. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Mumphy.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, since we don't have an actual treatment center here in the Northwest Territories, I'd like to know the cost. Over the last 10 years, how many clients have we sent to the Southern Institution, and how much did that cost this government? Masi.
Thank you, Member for Mumphy. Minister of Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll commit to get back to the member on exactly the numbers that he's requesting. I apologize, I don't have that with me right now, so we'll get back to the member on the numbers. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary, Member for Mumphy.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, obviously appreciate all the detailed information that Minister will be providing. My fourth and final question is, Mr. Speaker, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action number 23, calls upon all levels of government, including the territorial government, to increase number of Aboriginal professionals, retention of Aboriginal professional health care, and also training for all those health professions. Do we currently have in place all these areas of interest that has been highlighted as part of that calls to action in our communities, in our 33 communities, Mr. Speaker? Mussey.
Thank you. Member for Mumphrey, Minister of Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't have that information at this time. However, I will note that the department provides a number of services supports for mental health and addictions, including child and youth care counselors, facility-based addiction treatment, psychiatric care and treatment, the Northwest Territories Helpline, and the partnership between the land-based with Indigenous groups. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Nunukput.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have questions for the Minister of Education, Culture and Employment. What's the Minister's reaction on the findings of the audit, and what was in these findings, what concerns him the most? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Nunukput. Minister responsible for Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When I first took over this portfolio, I soon after became aware that we would be receiving a report to the Office of the Auditor General. And personally, I was happy to have this at the beginning of my term because as a former regular member, I was on the committee that looked at these reports, and I know how valuable they are. And so, I'm happy to have the information, and I wish I could say that it was a glowing audit. It wasn't scathing, but it obviously shows that we're not doing as well as we would like, and that we can do better. There's certain areas that are more concerning than others, namely because we've made progress in some areas that has happened since the report. So things with, for example, the languages. We have done much since the report came out, or rather since the auditor finished their report, that wasn't reflected in there. But there's things like the graduation rate, which was mentioned earlier. There is no universally accepted way to calculate graduation rates, but you never want to see something that shows that you're not graduating half your population. So there's nothing in there that I can say is shocking to me. I've been a member. I talk to people in the community. I hear the concerns about education. So we're very concerned. We're developing plans to move forward. But I want to also state that, the member noted that we're treating our students no better than cows to a slaughterhouse. And I just wanted to comment that when a student goes into a classroom, teachers treat them much better than cows to a slaughter. We have a dedicated staff. We have about 800 teachers in the territory. And I want to let them know that I support them and I support their efforts. And going forward, I'm going to make sure that we hear from them and we hear how to make these things better. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Nunukput.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let's just get this straight too. I support my staff in the communities in my riding across the territory. I deal with, I sat on the Education, Culture and Education Committee in my home community of Tuck for the last 3.5 years. And I support them. I support my youth. My youth, this EC&E is failing. It's not this minister's fault, it's prior. But at the end of the day, when the department has to be committed to adopting a more accurate method and getting graduation rates and the N.W.T to get more information broken down by the riding, Mr. Speaker. And that's all I'm asking for. We have our haves and have-nots in us in our riding in the small communities who are have-nots, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Nunukput. Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the thing I love about education is everyone is committed. I know that the member is passionate about education. I just wanted to reiterate my support for our teachers as well. The department has looked at the methodology they use to calculate graduation rates, and we've made a change that more accurately reflects, I guess, what you would call a true graduation rate, even though there really is no such thing. Different jurisdictions use different rates. For the territory, we have a lot of in and out migration. We have a small population, and so there is nothing that suits us perfectly. We tried looking at other graduation rates around the country. When we applied them to our situation, some groups of our population were graduating at over 100%. So clearly, it's not a cookie-cutter approach, but we have created a method now that more accurately reflects, I think, the number of students we have graduating. And to the member's point about this data collection, we've also created a framework regarding this data collection, and we're going to begin reporting yearly on a lot of these indicators. I know that this is the second report, and the first report made lots of comments about the lack of data. And this one makes those notes as well. And I have to say that we've come a long way in 10 years, and we've even come a long way since the work on this report was completed. So we now have a lot of that data that we didn't have before. And the thing we have to do now is analyze it and figure out exactly what it's telling us. Education is difficult because you can have the best teacher and you can have the best facilities in a class, but there's a lot going on outside that classroom. And there's a lot going on in students' lives. And so it's hard to say, does this program, is it helping students effectively? So those are the kind of things that this data is going to help us with, and we're going to develop our program so that we know that it's working, so that we can do a better job serving our students. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Nunavut.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, education is key to our success in our territory and to our people and to our youth, because our youth are our future. Will the Minister make a commitment to the Assembly to make a committee that will provide a draft copy of the Department's implementation plan in advance so the Standing Committee can have a public hearing? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Nunavut. Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The process with these reports is that the Department develops an action plan, which it then provides to the Standing Committee prior to the public meetings that are arranged between the Standing Committee and the Office of the Auditor General, and I guarantee that the committee will have a draft prior to that meeting. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary. Okay, oral questions. Oh, final supplementary, sorry. Member for Nunavut.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, thank you, Mr. Minister, for that response in regards to the advance notice on public hearings. But is the Minister prepared to take a closer look on social passing, Mr. Speaker, and consider ending this damaging practice that we're setting up our students for failure on social passing in the small communities and across the territory? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Nunavut. Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The term social passing is a bit of a misnomer. Students aren't passed into the next grade, they're placed in the next grade. If they don't achieve they don't get the credits, they don't do the work that they need to pass, they don't pass. They're placed in the next grade with their peer group, and they have lesson plans that are adjusted in order to meet that. I'm not going to commit to eliminating social passing, because right now there is no requirement for a student who doesn't achieve a certain level to be placed in the next grade. That's a decision made by the administrators, by the teachers, and by the school after they have a conversation. Every parent and student have a right to remain in a grade. If a parent and his teacher feels like a child needs to stay in grade 4 or 5 for a second time around, then that's their right, and they can have that conversation and they can do that. What I do commit to is working to better prepare students so that this doesn't become an issue. If we focus our efforts on early childhood and we ensure that students don't fall behind, we ensure that when a student comes out of JK, kindergarten, grade 1, grade 2, and they're at those levels, we're not going to have to worry about social passing anymore, because they're going to have the skills and ability to pass on their own merits. And that's what I commit to. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Hay River South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the questions I have today are for the Minister of ITI and Infrastructure. Yesterday, I made a statement on the economy, and the reality is that outside YK, the government is the economy. So my first question to the Minister is, what is your department's plan to put our northern business and residents to work as soon as possible? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Haver South. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Premier will be formally introducing our government's mandate during this session. I do not want to get ahead of the process and speak to its content in any detail today. However, I can confirm that our mandate will lay out actions and investments to address the priorities that we have identified. Those include more jobs, more business opportunities, and growth and diversity for our economy. Our mandate includes initiatives that are aimed at increasing employment in small communities, increasing resource exploration and development, ensuring government procurement and contracting maximizes benefits to residents and businesses, increasing economic diversification by supporting economic growth in and outside of the non-extractive sectors, and setting regional diversification targets. And we're going to adopt a benefit retention approach to economic development. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Haver South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I thank the Minister for that answer. I guess second question is with respect to the BIP policies. What will your departments do, or your department, I guess ITI, do to ensure our current BIP policies are doing what they are designed to do with respect to the application of them, fairness and monitoring to ensure our northern businesses and residents are really benefiting from them? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Haver South. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Government of the Northwest Territories Business Incentive Policy and the Northwest Territories Manufacturers Products Policy are designed to ensure government purchases are made through Northwest Territories' own businesses, and to leverage our government's purchasing power into investments in the Northwest Territories business and manufacturing sector. After speaking with stakeholders the last several months, I recognize there is a need to improve upon the Government of the Northwest Territories procurement and the business incentive policy. The departments of ITI and Infrastructure are working to address this and are looking for areas in which we can strengthen the government's procurement processes. We continue to offer training to increase awareness of our contracting opportunities and in the procurement process. In fact, workshops were held in January in Norman Wells, Toledo, and Hay River. We have committed to a review of procurement generally and the BIP specifically. It will be an opportunity to put everything on the table and to find a solution together. ITI is currently considering the process and results of past BIP reviews and will develop some options for how best we can move such an initiative forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Haver South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the next question is to do with payment to contractors. We find that in talking with a number of contractors, they've been waiting for payment they can wait up to 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 months. So what I'd like to ask the Minister is, what will your department do to ensure that our northern businesses are paid in a timely manner for work done, just so that we can avoid financial hardship and that we're putting them under? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member of Haver South, Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Mr. Speaker, I do acknowledge that prompt payment of invoices is really critical to our small businesses in the North. So we do have a government set of standards and expectations for the payments of these invoices, but I do acknowledge that system is not always working properly. The Financial and Employee Shared Services Division of the Department of Finance is responsible for processing and issuing payment for all supplier invoices for goods and services provided to all Government of the Northwest Territories departments, including the Housing Corporation and health authorities. But as the Minister of Infrastructure, I can tell you that it is an individual department's responsibility for managing the contracts, which includes timely processing of invoices for payment by our finance department. if this is an area where the member feels is lacking, and I have heard from others it may be, I think we need to look into including information on the payment terms and that process with our regular workshops that we're doing on procurement. So I will commit to including that in the next set of workshops. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Hayre South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Another area is the red tape. I think contractors find that the amount of paper that is required to be filled out for payments and for other areas as well is starting to increase and to the point where they've actually got to hire somebody to manage that, and yet there's no opportunity to recoup that. So I'd ask the Minister if her departments are looking at the paperwork they put out to, or the requirements they put out to contractors, and if there's something they can do to reduce that amount of paper requirement. Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Hayre South. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Speaker, as the members are probably aware, one of the reasons that I ran for office was my own frustrations with some of the red tape and inefficiencies I saw in the government of the Northwest Territories. Now sitting on this side of the table, I can appreciate it's a lot larger vehicle to steer and change course on. So I do acknowledge that there is issues generally throughout the entire government of the Northwest Territories with red tape. It's been a conversation that we've all been having as a larger group as well as within Cabinet, and all I can say is it is one of the commitments of our 19th Assembly is to streamline our processes, to get more efficient, and one of the ways we'll be doing that is to be looking for stakeholder feedback and inputting those messages into our processes going forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Ditcho.
Mr. Speaker, as the Minister of Infrastructure is aware of my opening statement regarding the transmission line from the Thompson Hydro to my community of Fort Providence, I just wanted to raise a point that the fact that I've just looked at the cost of transmission power in Fort Smith is currently at 23 cents a kilowatt hour. When I was there in 2006, it was 17 cents a kilowatt hour, and they were able to put electrical baseboard heaters in units without having to deal with diesel appliances, the furnaces and stuff. In my community of Fort Providence, we're on diesel. We're on a diesel plant. And right now, before the territorial subsidy rate, which is about half, covers, the rate in Fort Providence is 84 cents a kilowatt hour. So there's a significant difference there before the government rebates come on. So we're paying up pretty high, and the government's on the hook for paying all that too, because they're subsidizing the whole territory for power. And like I alluded to, that there's no watchdog. There's nobody actually talking to our own power corp, the NTPC either, about what they're doing to help the territories save on power. That's my concern there. But anyways, getting back to the transmission line to Fort Providence is, can the minister provide an update on the initiative to run the line into Kakiza and Fort Providence? Merci.
Can the member please direct, you mentioned infrastructure, but it sounds like Public Utilities Board. Okay. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you're correct. Some of this does lie in other ministers' departments. However, I can provide the member with an update on the Kakiza transmission line for Providence to Kakiza. It is a key initiative of our 2030 energy strategy. It roughly represents about 15% of our total reduction target for electricity generation. The proposed $52 million project involves the construction of the 170-kilometer line from from Thompson to Fort Providence, Kakiza, and Dory Point. The extent of the project is to use the surplus hydroelectric power from the Thompson system, the existing system, to virtually eliminate the use for diesel generation in the communities. There will be still emergency backup that would be diesel generated. The delivery of hydropower to customers in these communities should eliminate about 1 million litres of diesel consumption each year and will help us reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. This project is one of the best projects we have under the 2030 energy strategy in terms of greenhouse gas reductions, and without it, the Northwest Territories cannot meet its targets for our commitments that we've made. The government of the Northwest Territories has already set aside its 25% share towards the funding of the project, and we will be seeking 75% funding through the Investing in Canada Infrastructure Program this year. There are over $250 million in federal funding allocated to energy projects in the Northwest Territories over the next 10 years under the Investing in Canada Infrastructure Program. The government of the Northwest Territories must apply separately for federal approval for each individual project. The proposed routing for the transmission line is to follow the highway from Hay River to Fort Providence with an extension into Kakisa and the Dory Point area. The government of the Northwest Territories will be initiating appropriate engagement and consultation activities on this project in early 2020. Once consultation has been initiated, the government of the Northwest Territories will apply for federal funding under the Investing in Canada Infrastructure Program. We will undertake the environmental baseline work, and we will undertake the detailed engineering design and costing. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Colleagues, just a reminder, we're halfway through, so please keep your preamble and questions or answers a little shorter, to the point. Thank you. Member for Decho.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Minister for the update on the initiatives. It's much appreciated. I'm wondering if the Minister can provide the report or the update to the hamlet of Fort Providence on the initiatives and their strategy to get it going, because nobody in our community actually knows what is happening. I can't find any reports anywhere, and I'm just hoping that the Minister can provide some written record for our community and also for myself. Merci.
Thank you. Member for Decho, Minister of Infrastructure.
Mr. Speaker, yes, I will commit to the Department of Infrastructure providing a report to the hamlet on where the project is sitting at, and I'll apologize to the member that the communication hasn't been maybe what the hamlet was expecting and for yourself, so we will correct that and we'll do better in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Decho. Okay, thank you. Oral questions. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. My question is for the Minister of Justice. There doesn't appear to be any standards or process for developing regulations that includes public consultation or even co-drafting with Indigenous governments. So can the Minister tell us if there is a process under standards for making regulations in the Northwest Territories? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, regulations cover a wide breadth and variety of different types of topics. There's a variety that range from items that are fairly technical, some that are community specific. In some cases, consultation is built into the legislation itself. So no, there is not a single set standard at present in terms of how regulations are drafted in the Northwest Territories.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for that. I'll just give her an example. The federal government, they have a gazetting process that does allow for a 60 or 90-day period of public comment. We've got nothing here, apparently, or a patchwork. So, but I want to ask the Minister whether Cabinet has a position or taken a position on public consultation during development of regulations, particularly the regulations on post-devolution resource management. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this topic has certainly come up in front of Cabinet, and it's one that's already come up in terms of the Department of Justice taking a lead and being aware that this is something where we can do better. As far as what that will look like at the present time, I can't say, but it is our intention that we can have a better system in place to determine, as I said earlier, which regulations should be subject to public consultation, what that process would look like, and it is our intention to build that in so that it's more clear, so that the public knows, so that this House will know which regulations will be subject to a consultation and which and what that will then look like for those particular regulations. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister, member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for that response. So we've got something bubbling away maybe on public consultation with regard to development of regulations, but can the Minister tell us whether Cabinet is committed to co-drafting, to a co-drafting process for the development of resource management regulations? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Frame Lake. Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, again, that has also come up at Cabinet. That has also come up in the Department of Justice. And similarly, there are obligations within the devolution process to the Intergovernmental Council to ensure that there are, in some circumstances, that there will be a process that engages those partners. That protocol is also being worked on. And so, again, I'm in the same situation of while I don't have a specific that I can provide to the member, I can assure the member that that is in progress. And it is being actively worked on right now to develop something. So we have some standards in place, and so there's not this uncertainty around which ones are subject to that a more consultative type of drafting process and which ones are not. That kind of uncertainty should be eliminated, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary, member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for that response. Clearly, we need to clarify. The Minister needs to clarify what the process is going to be moving forward with development of regulations in terms of public consultation, co-drafting with Indigenous governments. I'm glad to hear that there's something bubbling away, that it's on their radar, but can the Minister tell us very specifically, is she going to work with and consult with the appropriate standing committees before final decisions are made by Cabinet on this? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Frame Lake. Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it certainly is the desire of Cabinet, as I hope the members are seeing, to be more consultative in our approach. As far as, I mean, there's two different streams we've spoken about. Firstly, more public consultation and developing that process for all regulations generally to determine which ones go through that process and which ones don't, as well as items that go through the Intergovernmental Council, and that may be subject to somewhat different processes. Certainly, once there is a stage for which regulations should receive general public consultation, I would commit to taking that through the committee and ensuring that they have an opportunity before a final decision is made to see what the approach, what the protocol might look like. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Nuvik-Twin Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Like I said before, my questions are for the Minister of Education. What is the plan of the department to ensure that we are preserving our languages, especially in my region, the Gwich'in and Inuvialuit language, before they're gone and we have no one to learn from? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Nuvik-Twin Lakes. Minister responsible for education, culture, and employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I spoke to this the other day. This is not an easy task. We have to combat 150 years of degradation to Indigenous languages in the territory, and it's tough, especially when the numbers of speakers are dwindling. We have a division within the department that is focusing on this. They're very passionate about it, and they have been making strides to work with Indigenous governments and work within schools by helping develop curriculum, which we're rolling out across the territory for the next couple of years, and will be fully implemented. The action plan that is being developed in response to the OAG's report, as well as our own internal findings, will address this and flesh these out a bit more. We're going to be looking to renegotiate or negotiate a new agreement with the federal government regarding money for languages, but we can't do this alone. This is, the government can't solve all problems, and especially when it comes to something as close to people and as vital to culture as language. So partnerships are going to be key. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister, member for Inuvik-Twin Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. More so with my question, I think what I'm looking for is there more of a plan to encourage, to train language speakers that we currently have so that they can be instructors or teach other people. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Inuvik-Twin Lakes, Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as I spoke the other day, the department has some partnerships with University of Alberta, University of Victoria, and we are making strides to train people to help revitalize the language. We have a mentorship apprentice program which pairs fluent speakers with those wishing to learn so that they can then learn. These are a few of the things we're doing, and as the member is well aware, there's work going on within the education authorities as well. She was a former chair of the Beaufort Delta Education Council, and she knows what the vital role they play as well. And so I know that each of the education authorities is doing work as well, in addition to the things that the department's doing, and we like supporting that as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Inuvik-Twin Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I'm going to go on to a different topic within the same member statement. What is the plan to ensure that our students are getting the education and support they need to move to the next grade on track, so that by the time they do reach grade 10, we're not losing them to drop out, and and then we see the high unemployment rates because they're not eligible to get jobs and stuff. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Inuvik-Twin Lakes, Minister responsible for Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When the Premier asked the newly elected ministers what portfolios they would want and why, one of the things I said when I said I'd like education is that one of my goals is to eliminate the need for social passing, for inclusive schooling, because all of our students would be on track right from junior kindergarten. And so some of the things that the department has already done are things like junior kindergarten, which will begin showing results. We're going to see that. There's a group of kids now who have access to more quality education earlier, and that's going to pay big dividends going forward. We have things like the child youth care counselors, which are rolling out across the territory to help students with issues that hinder their ability to learn. We have a territorial support team which can help, which teachers and administrators can reach out to, and so that they can get help with things like mental health. We have an educational psychologist, an occupational therapist, behavioral specialist, a speech language pathologist, all on staff to help teachers work with students to address some of their needs. But clearly more needs to be done, and I'm willing to look at different ways of proceeding with this. Inclusive schooling, social passing is controversial, but the other option is that you just don't pass students to the next. Students don't get placed in the next grade. They just get held back. And the consequence of that is higher dropout rates. So we want to find that ground where we are not losing students to drop out, but we're adequately preparing them. So we're working on it. I look forward to getting into more detail as we go forward, as we develop this action plan, but I'm committed to providing those supports. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary, member for Inuvik-Twin Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So just one last question. How do we ensure that the data that's being collected in each education board, because they are different and they're governed different, is being analyzed so that we're getting the same information across the board, so when we do sit here as a government, we're able to deal with those concerns? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Inuvik-Twin Lakes, Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have a framework. The name is escaping me right now, but it deals directly with this. It deals directly with data collection and how that data is processed. And we've standardized the way that we are now collecting this data from the education councils. And you know, my colleague is right. There's a separation between all of the education authorities and separated from ECE as well. And I think that one of the things we need to do, and this was mentioned in the Commissioner's address, is look at our Education Act and see if there's a way to better integrate our systems. Not to get rid of the regional authorities, but to facilitate that, that type of information sharing and collection that we need in order to be able to analyze what we're doing and ensure that what we're doing is generating results. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister responsible for Environment and Natural Resources, and ultimately the Minister responsible for climate change. Previously in this House, he refused to take a position on the Tech Frontier Resources project in Alberta, a project that will make sure Canada does not meet its emissions targets and will end up with the Northwest Territories dealing with 40 years of effluent from Alberta. Why is the Minister refusing to take a position on this project?
Thank you. Member for Yellowknife North. Minister responsible for Environment and Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I recognize that N.W.T. residents and members are concerned about the potential environmental impact of the proposed Trek Resource oil sand mine proposed downstream from here. As I said previously to the member from Frame Lake, the bilateral agreement with the Government of Alberta was signed in March 2015 that helps preserve the quality and quantity and the biology of the water flowing into N.W.T. Mr. Speaker, I want to inform the House and the public I have already spoken to Smith Landing Chief Cheesy about this issue, and will also be reaching out to the Alberta government to emphasize their commitment under the Alberta N.W.T. bilateral agreement. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I recognize the importance of transboundary agreements and the work that the Department of ENR is doing to monitoring, but our public service must remain impartial, and at times, issues become one of partiality. This is one of those such issues. The past week in Ottawa, members of the Liberal Party's own caucus were criticizing their cabinet for approving this project. And once again, I am questioning why we elect politicians who refuse to take political stances. I would ask the Minister, what is his position on this project?
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife North. Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I know politicians are supposed to take stances on things. It's easier when you're on the other side to do it. Right now, what I'm trying to do is work with the Government of Alberta to do what is right, and is actually implementing the transboundary water agreement. That's what I'm working on. I don't want to get out here and say, here I'm greatly saying against it or supporting it. What I'm trying to do is do the work right. Then we can go from there. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Yellowknife North.
I appreciate that answer, and it is the job of the department to make sure the work is done right. And it is easier on this side of the House to take a position. My position is that this project should not go ahead. And if it ruffles some feathers with Alberta or the Liberal government in Ottawa, I am fine with that. Because if we are going to take meaningful action on climate change, we must take positions. We must draw a line in the sand. In this case, the tar sand. What benefit does the Minister of ENR see that this project provides Northerners? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife North. Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
First answer, we're drawing lines here. What I'm trying to do right now is work with the Alberta government to make sure the quality of water that's coming out is good for our people. If it isn't, then that's when we come out and work again. I don't want to make a political stance saying yes or no about this. What I'm trying to do is do the job and is working with the Alberta government to make sure that whatever project they're doing does not have an impact on us. That is the most important aspect of it. Mr. Speaker, that's what we're trying to do. I don't want to come out here and say yes or no to something until we do the work first. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Kamloops.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have questions today for the Minister of Housing, but I see she's not here, so I'm going to redirect towards the Premier, if I can, please. What I'd like to ask today, Mr. Speaker, is how has this government engaged with Indigenous governments in partnerships to create housing in the Northwest Territories? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Kamloops. Honourable Premier.
Sorry, Mr. Speaker, I was unclear if it was Indigenous partnerships or just partnerships, so I would have to ask clarification on the question. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Member for Kamloops.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, specifically with Indigenous governments.
Thank you, Member for Kamloops. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Northwest Territories Housing Corporation takes working in partnership very seriously. There are many Indigenous governments actually that are moving into doing housing projects. I'll give an example of the N.W.T Regional Corporation, who in the last Assembly actually did a partnership with the Housing Corporation. The N.W.T Corporation received funding from the federal government. They worked closely with the N.W.T Housing Corporation to define the housing needs of people in their region, and then both the N.W.T Regional Corporation and the N.W.T Housing Corporation worked together in making sure the project was on the ground. This government is committed to doing more and more partnerships like that. The previous government had always felt, in fairness, that they felt that the money should come through the GNWT to allocate to Indigenous governments to have control over the housing, make sure the needs were being met, etc. This government has taken a different stance. We've already talked to the federal government, and that we're actually fine, totally fine, and actually advocating if the federal government gives the housing money to the Indigenous governments, that we will work with them to either in our own or if they want our support, but it's not about competition. This is about getting houses in the north, and we need to stop any kind of competition that means and keep the priority is that every person deserves a home. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Member for Kamloops.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the government have a timeline of when they would like to put together housing plans with each Indigenous government, and is there a desire to do one specifically and independently with each Indigenous government? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Kamloops. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Absolutely. The commitment to actually do housing plans, community housing plans in each community was a commitment actually from the last Assembly. I remember that housing minister bringing that forward. So during this Assembly, I know that they've just finished one with the community of N.W.T. And as they move forward, the goal is to have community housing plans in every community, because it's inappropriate for a government or any individual to believe that one size fits all. Every community has distinct strengths and distinct challenges, and if we're doing services under best practices, we work with communities, not telling communities what to do. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Final supplementary. Member for Kamloops.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the GNWT currently has 2,800 housing units. How does the territorial government plan to ensure that housing is available for every NWT resident as a human right? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Kamloops. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Unfortunately, the needs of all needs of any social issues, education, housing, legal support, all of them, our needs are greater than our resources. We're not denying that. However, you need to take care of the basic needs. That's Maslow's hierarchy that says food, clothing, and lodging. Take care of those first, and then you look at the higher needs. So this government is committed. We've been going down to Ottawa. I went down when I first was elected. Our housing minister just returned from Ottawa talking about housing. We need to keep advocating. I can't guarantee that we will have a house for every person, by the end of this assembly. I would love to make that commitment, but I have a feeling I couldn't fulfill that. What we need to do is work closer with our federal government, making them understand the needs of the territories are different and more intense than the needs of the South, where they have other options. Their cost of living is cheaper. Their resources are more plentiful. We need to work with Indigenous governments, and that's what we've done in the last Assembly and carrying forward, so that we work in partnership. There's a community housing program that the N.W.T puts in either labor or materials, and the community government, either Indigenous or community, can put in a portion as well, either labor or things. Those are the ideas we need to keep forward. We need to work in partnership. We don't have the answers ourselves, but together, all working together with Indigenous governments, community governments, the federal government, and the territorial government, perhaps we can make it a more humane world that we live in. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. As the second question was a clarification, we'll give the member for Kamloops another question. Your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I absolutely agree with Madame Premier's comment about how we need to leverage our partnerships, especially with people here in the Northwest Territories, and go to the federal government. So how has our government worked with Indigenous governments to make sure that the N.W.T is getting its fair share of the federal government's very ambitious national housing strategy, which is offering $40 billion to Canadians for housing? Thank you.
Thank you, member for Kamloops. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So again, in the last Assembly, it was more of a little bit of competition, feed the money through us. That didn't work very well for us. And so I tried to learn. We're politicians. I think one of the members had said, we're not God. And absolutely, we're not God. And so the best thing a politician can be is humble enough to admit when they need help. The worst politician, in my opinion, is somebody who thinks they have all the answers. So what we are committed to doing, we've already been talking with our Indigenous governments. We're talking about having a strategy. So not only around housing, but all of the issues that impact Indigenous people. So we're working on that now. We're not working on the strategy. We just put the feelers out. And I've had one meeting with our Intergovernmental Council. I've had 3 meetings with Indigenous governments since I've been here in the last few months. And even though some people think I'm not doing a lot, I'm doing a lot. And we brought forward the idea of going to Canada together with a united front. I've talked to them seriously about divide and conquer. When we all go individually, it does not work best for us. So we've agreed that we will be doing that. Not all the governments have been approached yet, but the ones that I have are in agreement that we need to have a strategy and go forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thought you might have forgotten me. Mr. Speaker, my questions are for the Minister of Health and Social Services. As I said yesterday and again today, there have been a number of issues related to the new hospital building, and also last we heard there was a shortage of nursing staff. Today, let's start with the nurses. In June, there was a 13% vacancy rate equal to 37 nurses. What is the vacancy rate now? And particularly, what is the net gain of nurses in the last 6 months when you account for those who've been hired and those who've quit? Thank you.
Thank you, member for Yellowknife Centre. It is very hard to forget you. Minister of Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As of December 31st, 2019, the vacancy rate across the NTSA, which is all the regions, all positions, was 12.3%. This represented 178 of 1,450 positions. The vacancy rates for some specific job types across the NTSA include 25% nurse practitioners, 15.5% registered nurses. As of December 31st, 2019, the vacancy rate across the NTSA, which is all regions, for frontline registered nursing positions was 17.1%. This represented 55 of 322 positions. As of December 31st, 2019, the vacancy rate across Stanton for frontline nursing positions was 10.3%. This represented 19 of 185 positions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate that answer from the Minister. It's a surprising answer to me because it was my understanding that the Stanton nursing workforce was 280 individuals, and the Minister's saying 185 individuals or full-time equivalents is in fact the total number. So there's some mismatch there which we need to get at, which is what is the total workforce and what is the vacancy rate within that. So I realize the Minister may not have that information to hand. But let me move on with whether the number of new hires has allowed nurses to reduce their overtime and to plan for holidays and vacations. So has overtime cost gone down? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife Centre. Minister of Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, efforts are underway as part of the overall recruitment process to ensure that Stanton Hospital has enough nursing staff to cover holiday leave and reduce the demands of overtime. As summertime approaches, that's what the department is looking into now. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for that. I know that was a point of unhappiness as last summer holidays came around. There weren't enough nurses to allow people to take time off. There was a commitment by the previous health minister to expedite the recruiting system and to get job offers into the hands of nurses more quickly. Are you able to say whether in fact that system has been expedited? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife Centre. Minister of Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I'm not aware, and I will commit to getting back to the member on whether or not the efforts are in place. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, finally, I want to talk about the heat regulation in the building. It seems to be a significant problem, and it affects both patients and staff. So what actions have been taken to figure out why some of the rooms and hallways are so cold and how to make them warmer? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife Centre. Minister of Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The member is correct. During the months of December and January, we were extremely cold here in Yellowknife. The building was not maintaining temperatures parts into the building. Cold air was being sucked into the building. Metal doors on the exterior of the building were frosting. In order to resolve these issues, Dexterra investigated and resolved air supply issues. Additional investigation is scheduled for spring of 2020. Additional heater was added in emergency entrance. There was resequence to the 2 sets of sliding doors. So those are a number of the issues that were done, and I respect that the staff up at the Stanton Hospital had to go through this, and I went up there and was able to speak to some of the staff, not all the staff, but just to reassure them that this is something the department is looking into. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Frame-Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I just have one question. It's for the Minister of Justice, if I may. In response to an earlier question, she did commit to consulting with the Standing Committee in looking at how the public would be engaged in the future around regulation making. That's great. But she didn't say anything about co-drafting and whether she would be consulting with Standing Committee on that. And I just want to remind her that in the last Assembly, Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment developed a whole report around co-drafting with lots of recommendations, ideas about how to improve that process going forward, including the involvement of standing committee. So I'd like to know from the Minister of Justice whether she's prepared to work with the standing committee on economic development and environment moving forward in looking at how Indigenous governments are going to be involved in co-drafting of regulations. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Member for Frame Lake, Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I did not speak specifically to co-drafting in terms of how that would look and what commitments might be made. And quite frankly, the reason is that if I make a commitment in this House, I'm going to take it very seriously. And I understand that co-drafting and the involvement of Indigenous governments, the involvement of the Intergovernmental Council, involves EIA, involves Cabinet, involves more than just the Department of Justice. And so I wasn't prepared to stand up and make that specific commitment here. Nevertheless, I can certainly commit to working with Standing Committee, making sure that I'm personally briefed and aware of what's in that report. And so to that extent, we'll move forward. But that's about as far as I'm prepared to go today, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister of Justice. Oral questions. Member for N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today I have questions for the Premier. Mr. Speaker, last 5 months, basically we had nothing going on in regards to short-term planning for any kind of jobs that we could create, or what's happening with any projects going on. Because once you leave Yellowknife and you head into the Delta, we have nothing going on in the SAW2, nothing going on in my riding. What's her plans on the go forward to stimulate the economy, Mr. Speaker, and jobs in short term? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for N.W.T. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've heard a number of times from the member that nothing's going on in this Assembly since we've been elected. I want to remind the member that this Cabinet has only been elected since November, so it's not 6 months that I've heard many times. We might have been campaigning 6 months ago, but the Cabinet has only been around since November. And I take offense to say nothing is going on. We are working on our mandate commitments based on the priorities of the 19th Legislative Assembly. But I need to say that the priorities are only what's extra. Day-to-day business within government programs goes on every day, whether we're here sitting in this House or whether we're back in our constituents or whether ministers are upstairs running their departments. Day-to-day government business goes on. There are projects in his riding. I believe there's a bridge going on. I hear there's a health centre being built right now. So there's projects that go on besides the extra things that we've identified as our priorities, besides the extra things that we decide as our mandate. If we didn't even have priorities or a mandate, this government would still provide services to the residents of the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Oral questions. Member for N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Those jobs are been given to a Nunavut company. There's nothing in regards to that bridge which they stopped work. So I want the Premier to identify which companies are working in my riding. First, I heard of a hospital being built. There's no hospitals being built. Get me clarification. All I'm asking is what's happening on the short term. All the government jobs are taken in our communities. Nothing's going on. That's why we have such a big income support problem that we have going on, because there's nothing going on. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for N.W.T. Honourable Premier.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a good thing we have ministers all around me talking to things. I believe the member had mentioned not only his riding but the SAW2 in his statement, and so the health centre is going into Toledo at this point. Inuvik is having a long-term care facility built at this time. So to have a whole list of every project and every contractor, that I don't have. It probably is something that should give notice of, so we can compile that information. But I will commit to getting a list of every major project, not every small project, that's too cumbersome, every major infrastructure project going on in the riding and the list of those contractors I will supply. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Member for Nunukput.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Madam Premier, you brought up 48 beds facility going up in Inuvik, which takes our elders out of our community. I need help in regards to keeping our elders home because we want to take care of our own elders. We don't need them shipped off to Inuvik where the people that I represent can't go see their loved ones. Only time they're going to go see them is if they're on medical or somewhere because cost of travel is too high. And then when they bring them home for a funeral, that's the problem. I need help in regards to getting a long-term facility in Ulakaktuk, Mr. Speaker. So would the Premier commit to that instead of putting 48 beds, which you already have 25 in Inuvik, taking elders out of our community? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Nunukput. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe it is almost 2 sets of questions, but I will reply to them yourself on the question. I'm not going to stand here and commit that I will have a long-term facility in every single community. I would love to see that again, just as I would love to have a house for every person. In honesty, I'd probably put the house first, Maslow's hierarchy, food, clothing, and shelter. Our seniors are important. Our elders are important. We recognize that. We have a shortage of health professionals. We know that. We need to look at a recruitment program. We know that. So I can't stand here and say that within this government I would guarantee that there will be a long-term care facility in every community. What I can say is that this government is committed to looking at whatever policies that we can do, that we can change, so that we can make it better for elders to stay in our homes, because we do know that the most humane thing we can do for our elders is to keep them close to their families and their friends as long as possible. But there are situations, times, when elders have to be shipped from homes because the care is not there in the communities. And again, I wish we could do better, but at this point in this economy, I think we have to be realistic and honest and say we don't have the staffing and we don't have the funding at this time. So we're willing to look at whatever we can do in the meantime. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Final supplementary. Member for Nunukput.
Mr. Speaker, all I'm asking is for the government, I guess, to relook at that 48 beds in Inuvik. They have 25 beds. We need, in our smaller communities such as Polituk, Tuk, and Ulakaktuk. Ulakaktuk is priority. I have elders sitting in the long-term care facility who are not seeing family, and it's hard on them. Too much hardship going on all the time. We don't have, everything's fly in, fly out on the coastal communities. The people of Ulakaktuk, Polituk, Sax Harbour need to have something to grasp on instead of taking them and pulling our elders out. And I'm just urging the Premier and the Cabinet to relook at that Inuvik facility. They have 25 beds. They don't need another 48. That's 200 more jobs they have to try to fill, which is good for Inuvik, but not for my riding on the Nunukput. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Nunukput. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Unfortunately, I can't commit to saying that I would stop a project in Inuvik. I mean, it would be very inappropriate for a Premier to stand here and make a commitment when there's been no research or assessment on the need. So I will not make a commitment to stop a project without the research done. Like I said, there is not a Cabinet member here that wants to take seniors or elders out of our communities. Every single Cabinet member understands the needs of our community, our seniors and our elders. But we have limited resources. And resources, not only money, but also capacity of staffing and qualifications. So we have to look at all of those as a holistic view before we make decisions on that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Colleagues, our time for oral questions has expired. Written questions. Written questions. Returns to written questions. Returns to written questions. Replies to the Commissioners. address. Replies to Commissioner's address. Petitions. Petitions. Report of committees on the review of bills. Report of committees on the review of bills. Reports of standing and special committees. Reports of standing and special committees. Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following document entitled 2019 to 2023 Mandate of the Government of the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to table the following documents. A letter dated January 16, 2020 to the Honourable Premier from Chief Wilbert Conchon of Bedzi Ada First Nation of Colville Lake regarding problems in current self-government negotiations. In addition, a letter dated January 16, 2020 to the Honourable Premier from the President of N.W.T Gwich'in Council, Joseph Karnagurski, regarding implementation of UNDRIP.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife North. Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Notices of motion. Notices of motion. Motions. Motions. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for Hay River North, that the Speaker be authorized to set such sitting days and hours as the Speaker, after consultation, deems fit to assist with the business before the House.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife North. Motion is in order to the motion. Question, all those in favour? All those opposed? Any abstentions? Motion is carried. Thank you. Notices of motion for the first reading of bills. Notices of motion for the first reading of bills. First reading of bills. First reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Consideration and Committee of the Whole of bills and other matters. Consideration and Committee of the Wholes of bills and other matters. Reports of Committee of the Whole. Report of Committee of the Whole. Third reading of bills. Third reading of bills. Mr. Clerk, orders of the day.
Orders of the day for Monday, February 10th, 2020, 1:30 p.m. Prayer, minister statements, member statements, returns to oral questions, recognition of visitors in the gallery, acknowledgements, oral questions, returns to written questions, replies to Commissioner's address, petitions, reports of committees on the review of bills, reports of standing and special committees, tabling of documents, notices of motion, motions, notices of motion for first reading of bills, second reading of bills, consideration in Committee of the Whole of bills and other matters, report of Committee of the Whole, third reading of bills, orders of the day.
This House stands adjourned until Monday, February 10th, 2020 at 1:30 p.m.